go. So this is the 10th lecture in this lecture series, and we are now firmly in the 21st century. And we're looking at the kind of partisan polarization that really was the motivation for this lecture series, the idea that at certain points, partisan competition becomes so extreme that it's unhealthy for democracy. It's unhealthy when it prevents the parties from, at some level, working together, influencing each other, being in dialogue, having meaningful deliberations about what the common good is. It's particularly destructive when one or the other political parties decides that it is to its advantage to try to undermine central institutions of democracy, to prevent elections from occurring, to discredit elections that don't go its way, to attack the independence and reliability of a free press, to try to undermine the rule of law. And while we are not all the way there yet, my concern is obviously that one of our two major parties is moving in that direction in terms of withdrawing support for democracy. And we'll pick up right where we left off last week in terms of our discussion of that. But more generally, that the level of partisan animosity that we see in contemporary politics forestalls democratic deliberation, healthy debate. And so that's where we are in this lecture series. And if you,
excuse me?
Yep, go ahead.
Are there historical precedents for this sort of activity?
Certainly there are, and I'm trying to see who is that? Was that Bob, or who asked that question?
That was Bob.
Yeah, okay, there you are, Bob. So I've spent some time talking about that history, right? And in particular, Daniel Ziblatt's work on the history of conservative parties and the birth of European democracy from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century, and the way in which, in particular, weak conservative parties have not been able to persuade old regime elites to play the democratic game, that they've got enough of a chance of prevailing, or at least having their interests protected by the party, that they're willing to make that transition into democracy. And then a little bit later into the 19th and early 20th century, when they begin to rely on insurgent right-wing populist groups to try to prevail, or when they turn to what Ziblatt calls anti-competitive methods, ways of trying to keep people from voting or commit fraud so that you don't have to wait for the count of the vote. You know what it's going to be in advance of the election because you've stacked the ballot boxes. Yes, there is definitely a history of this in modern representative democracy. And in particular, what we see is twofold. Not that there isn't left-wing populism, as we know, for instance, in the case of Venezuela, but it's more often right-wing or conservative. And that weak conservative parties that don't think they can necessarily win, that turn to anti-competitive mechanisms, that when they gain power, often don't want to relinquish it. So this is not to say that past is precedent. There are many things that have changed in the 21st century, among them the racial demographics of the United States, which is where we're going to pick up today, but also the media environment and the degree to which our media is polarized, fragmented, bi-directional, or generated by ordinary individuals. All of that changes. And then I would add a kind of countervailing consideration. We're a much wealthier society today, at least in the United States and much of the developed world, than was the case 100 years ago, the last time democracy seemed to be in similar conditions. And so there are a variety of precedents and then a variety of disanalogies. Does that help, Bob, to just think through a little bit the degree to which history gives us some guidance, but also were in the realm of politics, it's not the case that things
Yeah,
necessarily
that was
repeat. Sorry, Bob, go ahead. Okay, okay, good.
more
So,
than
uh, good, good. Let me then get back into refreshing our memory about the most recent lecture that I was drawing on this book by Ezra Klein, Why We're Polarized. And I had introduced you to Ezra Klein, who most recently is writing for the New York Times, wrote for the Washington Post, writes for Vox, one of, I think, the most interesting and insightful political science, I should say, political journalists writing in America today. And one of the reasons I think he's so interesting is he's deeply engaged with contemporary social science in ways that I think will come out in today's lecture. I pointed out to you that Klein is concerned that our polarization is structural, it's driven by incentives, that it's really hard to escape if you're in the world of electoral politics or the mass media. There are powerful structural forces that make compromise, bipartisanship, respect for the other side difficult. That our form of polarization has much more to do with identity than ideology. It is increasingly manifesting itself in ideological divisions, in divisions on policy questions, on who's liberal, who's conservative, who believes in big government, who believes in a minimal state. But that what's really driving it is not those policy or philosophical differences, but the sense that I am a Democrat or I am a Republican, and that is part of the core of my sense of political identity, and that means I must be different from the other side. And then we rationalize those differences in policy differences. That once we get this kind and this degree of polarization, we end up in a cycle which makes it more and more extreme. That on the one hand, our representatives, members of Congress, presidential candidates, state officials find it advantageous to not cooperate, but instead demonize the other side, that it's become a central strategy for gaining and maintaining market share in both broadcast media and online social media to differentiate yourself and then to get a loyal audience. And so it's also the media that this drives then polarization on the part of ordinary people. And once ordinary people become polarized, political and media elites will become further polarized, and the cycle repeats, continuing to escalate the degree to which we are polarized. So Klein suggests that the level of polarization we have experienced over the last 4 or 8 years is not going to plateau, but going to instead keep getting worse, that we're not as bad as it can and predictably will be if we continue on this path. He also suggests that polarization is not necessarily a bad thing. You want clear choices between the parties, and that is a central mechanism of accountability in modern representative democracy, but that the kind and degree of polarization that we have in the United States today is dangerous, in part because it's negative, because we concentrate much more on what's wrong with the other side than positive attributes of our own side, in part because that then taps into deep psychological tendencies in the human social mind. I'll be talking more about that later in this lecture, that in fact tend to make us more hostile to the other side, to categorize ourselves in in-group and out-group and begin to really think of the other side as dangerous to us. And that this also distorts our capacity to think things through on the basis of evidence. And We therefore are limited in our ability to solve problems. We're thinking in distorted ways. We're unable to cooperate or discuss things, and particularly in our political system, given its checks and balances, that makes it difficult to get anything done. I've shown you this diagram at least twice now. And it's the jumping off place for the conclusion of the last lecture, which is where we are at right now. This incredibly sharp disparity in the racial composition of the supporters of the two major parties in our country. The idea that the Republican Party is 90% white in terms of its electorate, that the Democratic Party is not yet there yet, but it's on its way to becoming a majority-minority party. It is already a clearly interracial coalition party. And when we combine that with the demographic trends in the United States today, what that means is that the Republican Party is on its way to becoming a permanent minority party. But having said that, the other thing to notice about this diagram, right, is that, of course, America will remain largely white. Even if it's no longer majority white, it will be plurality white. And so a party that at least manages to get a significant share of the white vote, while not necessarily being able to muster a majority of the popular vote in national elections in many states, will remain a viable political party, and especially in the institutional and constitutional structure of the United States that amplifies the power of less populous states, that allows for partisan districting at the congressional level for the House of Representatives, and in which the Supreme Court and Congress seem increasingly either reluctant or incapable of enforcing more aggressive voting right measures, a strategy of attempting to turn a substantial portion of the popular vote, but not a majority, into majority power appears to be a viable strategy for the Republicans in the 2020s. I think these things may change. It's not just that the Republican Party is mainly white, it's also that it's mainly older. And as we get a turnover in our demographics, this strategy of appealing primarily to white voters may become increasingly difficult to maintain. We noted that white liberals are becoming increasingly progressive in their views on issues of racial justice, while white conservatives are in fact becoming, staying hostile to that entire agenda. And so it's not just that our racial demographics are changing in ways that polarize us, it's also that our ideological or policy positions are also aligning along that racial cleavage line. And so we left off thinking about this data from Larry Bartels, this survey, and then I found a better way of representing. This is obviously not particularly appealing visually, but I think you get the point, right? That 50% of Republicans either strongly agree or agree with the proposition that the American way of life is disappearing so quickly that we have to use force, or we may have to use force to save it, right? And 75% of Republican or Republican-leaning voters say it's hard to trust elections because so many people will vote for anyone who offers a handout. And obviously there's a racially coded dimension to that question. Who exactly is it that's getting a handout to buy their vote, right? And what we found, unsurprisingly, what Larry Bartels found is that there's a very strong correlation between ethnic antagonism and these views. There are Republican-leaning voters who show very little ethnic antagonism, and they also don't say that it's hard to trust elections or that they want to use force to save their way of life. But once you go up the scale of ethnic antagonism, you see very high correlations with the idea that we need to mistrust election, take the law into our own hands, elect strong leaders who bend the rules, use force if necessary. And so having said all of that, right, remember, this was conducted in January of 2020, the survey. The results were published in July of 2020 prior to the 2020 election. And then in January of 2021, January 6th, almost exactly 6 months ago, we saw this, right? We saw an assault on the Capitol, an invasion of the Capitol, on the day in which the Electoral College was certifying the victory of Joe Biden, the defeat of Donald Trump. And so in a sense, right, going back to Bob's question at the very beginning, I've put the image of the Reichstag fire on the screen. We should not be surprised in light of, right, the fact that 75% of Republican voters were saying in January of 2020 that it's hard to trust elections, and 50% of them were saying that they might use force to save their way of life. This is not a surprising outcome, right? And in a sense, the perverse genius of Donald Trump is recognizing that a large share of his supporters don't trust elections, and then laying the groundwork in the summer of 2020 to suggest that if he lost the election, it had to be fraud, and then agitating to provoke his supporters, who he knew many of them bought into this way of thinking that suggests that they are endangered. And we looked at those quotes from James Baldwin and Ezra Klein last week on how identities become salient when they become fragile, and the sense that the identity of white people has been subject to a kind of racial discomfort over the last 20 years. Jennifer Richardson's claim about the democratization of racial discomfort. I'm seeing a little message from my computer that says my internet connection is unstable. I'm trying to see if I'm on the right Wi-Fi. Let me just take a quick look, and I'm not. Was that interfering with your ability to hear me or follow me? Are you hearing me now? Are you hearing me now? Okay, are we back?
Yes.
Yes.
And how long was the interruption for?
It was just a few seconds, but it happened several times.
Yeah, please do let me know if that happens again. I have something that boosts my Wi-Fi, and sometimes my computer goes onto the wrong channel, if you will. It wasn't on the boosted Wi-Fi. Apologies. Let me pick up where I left off, and I believe I was talking with you about what happened on January 6th, and about the idea that we got from both Ezra Klein and James Baldwin in our last lecture, that it's when identities are fragile that they become salient, that they become more self-consciously the focus of the individual whose identity they are. That we are in increasingly an era of white identity politics because white people are aware that they're losing their electoral majority, losing some of their power, that some of the history of this country that was built on racial exploitation, injustice, exclusion, marginalization, depending on which period we're talking about, different terms are necessary to describe the kind of racism, the kind of privilege that white people experience, the kinds of dispossession that African Americans experience, that this is all becoming more central to our politics, more difficult to avoid, and that it is promoting a kind of politics of white nationalism, white grievance, and that Trump's supporters found in Donald Trump the perfect vehicle for expressing this kind of politics. And so given what we know from the opinion research and what we see in our news, we shouldn't be surprised. We obviously should be dismayed. We should be alarmed, and we should be thinking through what we can do to respond to preserve and strengthen our democratic institutions, but we shouldn't be surprised that this occurred. And so that's kind of to bring to a head the findings on racial polarization. I'm now going to shift away from racial polarization into a very closely related issue, but into a series of policy issues where it seems to me that polarization is clearly roiling our politics, paralyzing, or at points creating real problems for our society. So the first of these policy/culture war issues concerns the partisan gap in the trust of contemporary American elections. And as you can see, this dropped dramatically, right? As we got to the election, right? And as it became clear that Trump would lose and had lost, the share of Republican trust in the electoral process plummeted. We're now at a point where, and this is a little bit out of date, but roughly 70% of Republicans say they do not trust, they do not think that the outcome was fair or accurate, the 2020 election, and more generally, they do not believe or trust the electoral system of the United States, the system that gave them Barack Obama as president, that has given them, right, 3 out of 4 of the last presidents as Democrats, that has given them a biracial woman for their vice president. And on the other hand, Democrats mainly trust the electoral system. Independents mainly trust the electoral system, although, you know, a world in which roughly a third of your registered voters don't trust the electoral system, obviously democracy is not as healthy as it could be. Now, this is not just a general dis-ease with the election system that has a strong partisan slant to it. This is giving rise to legislation. And this is from the Brennan Center, which if you're interested in this, I recommend their site to you. They collect all of the voting legislation that is present in the United States today. And on their account, there are now over 400 bills that have been proposed at the state level to restrict in various ways access to the vote, to confine the period in which voting can take place, to make it more difficult to get absentee or by mail ballots, to not allow the easier forms of voting like drop boxes, to decrease the number of polling stations, to allow and empower partisan vote monitors to challenge the ability of individuals to vote. It's still not clear to me, or to I think most people who study this with an open mind, whether all of this actually works, right? Some of it, I think, is more pernicious. The voter ID legislation, the purging of the voting rolls can be more effective at keeping people from voting. But generally speaking, it seems to me that oftentimes this legislation, as opposed to keeping people from voting, merely makes it more difficult for them to vote, but it's met with resolve, organization, greater funding of get out the vote drives, the Stacey Abrams approach, if you will, in Georgia. Now, we know, and this is familiar, I think, to you, that the vast majority of this legislation is sponsored by Republicans, some of it sponsored by Republicans in states like California, where it's got absolutely no choice of passing. But we also know that there are 14 states in the United States that are completely controlled by the Republican Party. And in these states, this legislation has a great chance of passing and being upheld. We will have to see what the implications of the most recently decided Supreme Court decision will be for all of this. But it certainly is the case that for the last decade, the Supreme Court has been narrowing the categories of scrutiny, making it more difficult for voters to challenge these kinds of laws. And in these 14 states, which have already passed, I believe, around 28 bills, the voters, I'm sorry, the Republican Party is able to do this in part because not only do they control both the governorship and both houses of the legislature, but they also control the Supreme Court at the state level. So the likelihood that there's going to be successful challenges at the state level is negligible. And so all of this to say, one issue that we are highly divided on right now is the issue of access to voting. And as of those of you who are following the national legislative efforts in Congress to try to shore up the Voting Rights Act bill or to put new voting rights legislation in place, this is a frustrating issue. And I think there's going to be increasing friction over the rules of the game. Is this fair play, or is this an effort to undermine democracy by a party that recognizes that when more people vote, it is in danger, right? And so it's a voter suppression effort. Whether or not it succeeds, that is something that is going to sow the seeds of mistrust, of animosity. And this then contributes to, and in fact, really taps into some deep psychological roots to polarization. And give me one moment. I left my book off to the side. I think this is one of the things that Ezra Klein is most insightful and most valuable on. And so he starts with a variety of research that suggests that there are different kinds of political psychology that we find when we survey voters, citizens, persons in almost every society. This is not a uniquely American 21st century thing. At least that seems to be what the finding in psychology supports. And so Jonathan Haidt, whose work The Righteous Mind I've spoken with you about before, Karen Stenner on the authoritarian dynamic, I've also spoken with you about that before, both find that there are a large number of people for whom rapid cultural change is perceived to be quite threatening, who are not open to living in a world in which identities, expectations, norms, roles change very quickly. And that in fact, they prefer stability, authority, they view certain kinds of changes as forms of almost disease that prompt in them disgust and fear. And Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Wheeler in this sphere have done very good work on the way this is playing out in America in the 21st century, the way in which we mark our identities by the kind of vehicles we drive, the kind of music we listen to, where we shop, what we eat, where we live, as belonging to one or the other of these psychological groups. And I've shared this diagram with you before. It's actually of my making, but it's just trying to synthesize these ideas. And the suggestion is that there really are two different ways of thinking about political polarization. One of them is primarily ideological, that you have people on the left and you have people on the right. For instance, the people on the left believe in a big government that they use to break up monopolies and to tax so that there's not too much concentration of income or wealth in their society, so there's fair and equal opportunity for advancement, etc. The people on the right tend to be much more about minimal government and allowing people to keep what the market allocates to them. Whereas this second divide is less an ideological divide and more a psychological divide, right? That there are people who are cosmopolitan, who are open to change, who like and embrace those who are different from them and are comfortable with rapidly changing identities, roles, norms in their society. If you think about, and I know it's happened in your lifetime, and I'm sure you have noted it, the rapid transformation in norms surrounding sexuality. I think we all grew up at a moment where it was very difficult to be openly gay, and many people who had same-sex sexuality or sexual attraction closeted or hid it. And we now not only permit as a constitutional right same-sex marriage, but we have lots of models of same-sex or fluid sexuality in the media all around us, right? And for those who are cosmopolitan, open to change, enjoy diversity, flexibility, new possibilities, this is a welcome development. This is energizing. This is invigorating. But for those who find this kind of change to be a challenge to authority, to be threatening, this is extremely disturbing. And so one of the things to note is that in a sense, these psychological types, according to this literature, should probably not be moralized, that they are either present from birth, that there's probably some genetic predisposition to them, but they're also certainly socialized from a very young age, right? And so it's different from an ideological position having a psychological disposition. And in particular, as our society becomes increasingly post-traditional, and I'm using that in a kind of technical way, the fastest growing religious group in the United States is the group that says it does not subscribe to any organized religion. And this is coming on the heels of the United States being, throughout its history, one of the most religious societies in the developed world. And it is the case that Protestantism is declining rapidly, and that at the same time, many of the normative expectations that religion gives rise to around gender roles, around marriage, around procreation, around belief and behavior have been called into question. We are, if not fully secular, at least increasingly post-traditional culturally. We do not get our cultural bearings from traditional religious institutions for the people on this end of the psychological spectrum. And again, the findings are not entirely clear, but it looks like it's usually around a third of the population of any society, around a third on this end, and then some people in the middle as well. For the third that's in that traditional authoritarian closed group, this is very threatening. And I just want to point out to you very quickly that in an era in which you are threatened by the erosion of traditional moral norms, roles, and expectations, that is also democratic. So you get to elect your leaders. You may very well turn to leaders who promise to reimpose traditional moral roles on your society, and that this is fundamentally different, at least in two respects. One of them is that, as opposed to tradition being, if you will, organic, coming out of the voluntary, taken for granted, unself-conscious behavior of individuals, it is enforced, it is constructed, it is legislated. If you think about what's happening in Texas right now with the current anti-abortion statutes that puts ordinary people in the role of enforcer, right? This is another clear example of the difference between a constructed and imposed tradition as opposed to a voluntary, organic, natural, or cultural tradition. And the second way in which the effort to impose or reimpose cultural conformity on a post-traditional society differs is it becomes a partisan issue, right? You've got one party all of a sudden that isn't just the left party calling for redistribution or the right party calling for libertarianism. The way this tends to align is you also have the right party calling for the reassertion of authority and tradition, and the left party calling for openness and acceptance, toleration, embrace of new people, new ways of life. And that tends to further deepen our partisan divides. And so we're now looking at two issues that have aligned with partisan identity. One of them is race. Are you a racial progressive? Are you a racial conservative? We know pretty much if you're a Democrat or a Republican based on that. That wasn't true for most of American history. Similarly, are you a traditionalist? Are you relatively hostile to rapid cultural change? Or are you a cosmopolitan who embraces it and demands that the law tolerate it? Again, the two parties didn't necessarily sort out along that dimension now they are. And so that is deepening our sense of partisan division. And when we align multiple dimensions of identity and ideology, religiosity, psychology, geography, race, all appear to be sorted along partisan lines, then partisan identity carries very strong psychological signals with it. It doesn't just say, this is the way I vote. It says, this is the way I worship. This is where I live. This is the group I belong to. This is the psychological type of personality that I have. And this tends to deepen then this dimension of our identity, to make it perhaps an uber identity, an identity that is stacked or overarching, that subsumes all these other differences. And what we know from social psychological research is when our identities seem fundamental to us, and when we are in a situation where there's a clear division between us and them, between an in-group and an out-group, aspects of our deep social psychology, also our deep brain structure, get triggered, and they tend to take over. You're familiar with some of these experiments where you tell kids in school that there's a fundamental difference in intelligence or capacity between those with blue eyes and those with brown eyes, and pretty soon the whole class is divided, and those with the preferred eye color are discriminating against those with the subordinate eye color, and those with the dispreferred eye color are becoming sheepish and intimidated, right? And we've seen this in various studies. Muzaffar Sharif doing the studies of the boys on the Robbers Cove Camp Island, where he suggests identities, you know, I forget, eagles and what the pirates, is that the other group, and very quickly the boys are engaging in violent competition with each other. Henri Tajfel did, I think, even more interesting research in terms of how arbitrary and superficial these differences can be. He put subjects together in a lab and asked them to look at a screen and to identify how many dots there were on the screen. And they did this on paper, and he threw away the paper. But he told them, you identified more dots on the screen, you identified less dots on the screen, and he divided them into two groups, right? Those who saw more and those who saw fewer dots. And then he gave them ways of rewarding or punishing each other. And he found that you would reward your totally arbitrary, superficial, just created, not even based in fact, identity group over the other group. Right? You wouldn't be impartial. You wouldn't be fair. And not only that, and here's the real kicker, you would actually do things that damaged yourself or your group to be able to damage the other group more. Right? And this then, and let me read a little bit of the book to you, because I think this is so fascinating and at the same time so troubling. Reading pages 49 and 50 of Klein's Why We're Polarized, he says, speaking of Henri Tajfel and experiments he was doing in the 1970s, Tajfel thought the way we treat people we decide aren't like us isn't a product of our specific culture or experience, but something deeper, something that reflects how humans think, organize, and bound their social worlds. And Tajfel is a, I think, Austrian Jew who ended up migrating to Britain to avoid the Holocaust, and then he encounters Armenians who are saying things about Turks that sound an awful lot like the things that Germans are saying about Jews. And that's what triggers this idea that maybe this stuff is not just reflective of the particular history and culture that people belong to. Quote, the most important principle of the subjective social order we construct for ourselves is the classification of groups as we and they, he wrote. And once someone has become a they, we are used to dismissing them, competing against them, discriminating against them, and Tajfel hypothesized in a particularly chilling sentence, we will do that even if there is no reason for it in terms of our own interests. It is worth dwelling on the radical conception of human nature Tajfel was advancing. People had long nurtured their prejudices, but they believed those prejudices reflected reality. We disliked those we disliked because we had reason to dislike them. This is the whole point of racial and ethnic stereotypes. The greed, criminality, venality, or idiocy we ascribe to others justifies our hatred or fear of them. The post-Enlightenment view of humanity is that we are rational individuals whose actions may be inflamed by instinct, but are ultimately governed by calculation. But what if it was the other way around? What if our loyalties and prejudices are governed by instinct and merely rationalized as calculation? And what Klein, I think, does so well is to show the implications of this social psychological research for our contemporary forms of political and partisan polarization, that there are deep-seated structures of the brain and human psychology that lead us to think in these terms, that are triggered when we divide the world into an in-group and an out-group, that we are increasingly encouraged by our political and media environments to view the world in exactly that way, and that when we view the world in that way, it dictates how we think our identity, how we view those who do not belong to our political group, and how we think about a whole range of problems. And so here I want to turn to the work of Dan Kahan, and I'll be turning in a moment to the work of Daniel Kahneman. I want you to keep those two separate because they're two different people. Dan Kahan is actually a law professor at Yale University, but who does work that's very much indebted to psychology. And he does these experiments where essentially he sets up complex math problems and suggests to you that the answer to the problem either supports or opposes your pre-existing political perspective. And then he asks you to solve the math problem. So it's a problem about, for instance, whether or not redistributive taxation benefits the economy as a whole or hampers the economy as a whole. And what he finds is that if you believe that the answer to the problem supports your political view, all of a sudden you become a lot better at math, right? You reason more clearly, more carefully, you do the problem solving better. If you believe that the answer does not support your political perspective or policy preferences, you become considerably less good at thinking, reasoning, problem solving. And he does this across a whole number of different domains, not just mathematics. And he comes to the conclusion that there's something that he calls identity protective cognition, which is to say, when we want to support our conclusion, we're very good at finding evidence, analyzing it, reasoning about it, and demonstrating that it in fact makes us rational to believe what we believe, right? And on the other hand, when we are presented with evidence that challenges a central identity. And remember, part of what Klein and others are showing is how important partisan identity has become to personal identity in 21st century America, how it serves to organize racial and religious and geographic identities as a overall stacked identity. It becomes very hard to see the evidence, digest the problem solving that is required to analyze something that challenges your identity. And so it's not just that we stereotype the other side, that we dismiss them, that we discriminate against them. And please note, I think this is very important to see, that this is one of the few identities that it remains legitimate in our society to discriminate against. I think this is part of the genius of Trump, is to make discrimination on the basis of race feel like partisanship, right? And so it's not only all of those social psychological tendencies to treat the in-group favorably and the out-group disfavorably, it's also distorting the way in which we reason, our cognitive processes, the ability to assess evidence. And please note, I shared with you last week Diana Mutz's work that shows that it's really hard to even listen to the other side if you don't have a civil disposition to the other side and to the legitimacy of disagreement. And so then what we have now is mega or stacked identities. Partisanship is encompassing all these other differences. We know what the psychological consequences of this are. And this helps to then, I think, contextualize the work of Liliana Mason, which I've described to you before, her wonderfully titled article, I Disrespectfully Agree, which shows that at least in the first half of the last decade, our policy disagreements, our ideological disagreements were not that much sharper than they were in the decade before that, but that our animosity to the other side was much higher, and therefore we were inclined to exaggerate our degree of policy discord with the other side. And so that it's identity, not ideology, that drives contemporary polarization. We've looked at that before, but now we have a much deeper understanding of the social psychological roots that is, on the one hand, creating and enforcing that identity, and on the other hand, making it a hostile and encompassing identity. And then we come back to the demographic dimension, right? That threatened identities, Baldwin calls them menaced identities, are defensive and venomous, not only salient, but also particularly self-protective in ways that lead you to strike out at the other group. So this then, I think, is a really important and insightful description of the roots of the kind of polarization we have in the 21st century and why it's going to be hard to counteract or address. Let me stop there and ask what questions or comments you have at this point. Is this social psychological angle on partisanship helpful in thinking about it? Was it something that was already familiar to you? These experiments, particularly those by Sharif, I know are well known. We read about them in the popular press. Did you have this on your mind already when you were thinking about contemporary partisanship? Who wants to start us out? Yeah. So, Marion, go ahead. And I think you're unmuted. Go ahead.
We've recently had some artistic demonstration about the polarization that you've been describing. We saw a few nights ago West Side Story,
Hmm.
Saw the difference between sharks and jets, although nobody on the outside could tell the difference between them. They each knew where they belonged, and they were ready to kill for, to represent their, and stick to their own party. And we know that this came originally from the 16th century when Shakespeare wrote it in Romeo and Juliet. So it obviously has been part of human behavior for a long time, represented not only in our politics, but in our arts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's going back to Italian familial rivalries. Was the version of West Side Story you saw one of the original versions from the, I think it's 50s, right? That Leonard Bernstein retold the story? Because I know there have been some contemporary versions that have tried to be a little bit more critical and nuanced in their presentation of the racial divides of New York City that Bernstein was comparing to Romeo and Juliet.
I'm not sure, but I think it was from the original movie anyway.
Okay. Yeah. No, and so look, there's a reason Shakespeare is telling that story. There's a reason that the idea of feuds and vendettas and ethnic warfare. I mean, please note that in many respects, if you were to talk about the original work of art of Western culture, right, we would be talking about the Iliad, right, of Homer. And what is the Iliad? It's a story of ethnic warfare, right? It's the story of the Greeks sacking the Trojans. And so, yes, this is, and that's part of the point. It's deeply rooted in human nature. And look, I'm not an evolutionary biologist or psychologist, but the idea is that for much of human and probably pre-human history, this probably is rooted in our animal brains, in our primate ancestors, knowing who was on your side and being loyal, generous, self-sacrificing to those people was essential to survival, to passing your genes on to the next generation. As essential, of course, was recognizing the enemy and fighting viciously to protect your group from their group, right? And so, it's not an accident that art and psychology and politics can fall into these grooves. They're deep in human nature, according to this literature. Bob, go ahead.
I'm just, well, as you know, I'm a liberal, and I feel like I shouldn't have all these animosities towards anyone. Is there any test that is given, like an IQ test, that says you are so partisan that you don't deserve to be a part of this society, or you're reasonably accommodating to everyone?
Yeah, so there are these tests that are administered by psychologists. They're not really, I think, directly tests of partisanship, but they are tests, and then there are different versions of them. Some of them are so-called authoritarian personality tests, which uses a simple dichotomy. Are you, and often it's the surrogate for it is not political, it's attitudes to parenting. Right? So do you want your children to ask lots of questions, show lots of curiosity, be creative, and ultimately do what makes them happy? Or do you want your children to obey traditional authorities, including yourself? Do you want them to be of the same religion and replicate many aspects of your life? And then we find that turns out to be highly predictive of attitudes about authority in politics, right? Then there are more complicated ways of testing this, which look at the value of freedom, the value of equality, the value of loyalty, the value of maintaining group purity as well. This is Jonathan Haidt's research, and he breaks down 5 or 6 different components of human moral psychology and scores you on each of them, and then tries to correlate that with who you support politically. So yes, there are tests that test our psychology and then try to draw out the political implications of our psychology. I don't think there are tests that try directly, maybe there are, but I'm not aware of them, how much partisan animosity you feel, and whether or not that in some sense impairs your capacity to be a good citizen. Let me conclude very quickly by saying, you know, and I didn't fully get into this today, but some of the research by Daniel Kahan and others on the way in which we reason and our ability to confirm what we already believe, right? Or to reason well about what we want to believe and somehow not manage to even remember the evidence for what we don't want to believe. That we should scrutinize ourselves and look to see if we're doing this, right? And in particular, we should be a little suspicious of ourselves if it happens to be that we think that our party gets it right on everything, right? What made our party the infallible detector of the true, the wise, the just, and the other party so broken in its compass that it never gets anything right, right? You know, that you should be suspicious of yourself if you line up exactly in those ways. That's more cognitive. You said IQ. There's also so-called EQ, emotional intelligence, right? And I think another aspect of this would be, can you detect the humanity? Show some sympathy for, and I'll swallow twice before I say Trump supporters, right? Can you find it in you to say, okay, I vehemently disagree with your politics, but that doesn't mean I'm going to generalize from that to the idea that you must be an awful person, right? And that would be another way of thinking about this. And please don't get me wrong. If somebody wants to endorse a policy that separates migrant children from their parents, I am going to oppose them vehemently on that policy. But that does not have to extend to a global moral judgment on them as a person. I guess I think I can maybe try to strike that balance. Maybe not in the heat of the moment, but at least I've got to work on getting nuanced, balanced enough to be able to do that. Thank you for the good question, Bob.
That might be possible on a single issue.
Yeah, and of course, part of what Klein is showing us is the problem is that all these issues are aligning and all these other identities are lining up as well. Anybody else with a final question for today? All right. Well, we will continue next week. We're getting closer to thinking about not just how to understand this, but what to do about it. And so a little promissory note that's coming. You guys have good weeks. Stay safe, be well. Fun as always to get to share part of Saturday with you. Take care and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, David.
My pleasure. Thanks. See you soon.